They were called the Lion of Islam, an army so disciplined that they could march in total silence, and so deadly that they erased the Roman Empire from the map. For 300 years, the Ottoman Empire was the undefeated heavyweight champion of the world. Kings in Paris and London would bow their heads when the sultan's letter arrived. They were invincible. Or so they thought. How did a military titan, armed with the best technology on earth, turn into the sick man of Europe? How did the empire that invented the modern army end up being sliced up piece by piece by the very nations it used to terrify? You are watching Be Explained, and this is why the Ottoman Empire collapsed. To really understand how they crashed this hard, we have to look at the dark secrets behind their eyes. The Ottoman system was brutal, but it worked. For a long time, the empire survived on a law written in blood, the Law of Fratricide. It sounds horrific to us today, but it was simple. To prevent civil war, a new sultan was legally required to strangle all his brothers the moment he took the throne. It was cold-blooded, but it ensured that only the most ruthless, capable leader survived to rule. But in the 1600s, they changed the rules. They decided, okay, maybe strangling our brothers is a bit much. So they created something arguably worse, the golden cage. When a sultan died, his brothers weren't killed. They were locked in a luxurious prison inside the palace. Imagine being a prince, but you spend your entire life locked in a few rooms, cut off from the real world, constantly terrified that the executioner is coming for you. So, when the throne finally became empty, the empire stopped getting warrior kings like Suleiman the Magnificent. Instead, they got paranoid, inexperienced men who had been locked in a room for 40 years. They had no military training, no political clues, and often they had lost their minds. The brain of the empire had stopped working, and while the leadership was rotting at the top, the muscle was getting weak. You cannot talk about the Ottomans without talking about the Janissaries. Originally, these guys were the most feared soldiers in history. The empire took boys, raised them with fanatical loyalty, and turned them into the first modern army in Europe. They were disciplined, uniformed, and deadly. But over the centuries, the Janissaries realized something dangerous. Wait a minute, we have the guns. They realized that if they didn't like a sultan, they could just remove him. They stopped living in barracks and started owning businesses. They got soft. They became corrupt. They basically turned into a mafia that extorted their own government whenever a sultan said, "Hey, maybe we should get some new weapons to keep up with Europe." The Janissaries would riot. They would overturn their soup cauldrons in the streets and demand the sultan's head. It got so bad that when a young sultan named Osman II tried to fix the army, they didn't just say no. They dragged him out of his palace, humiliated him in the streets, and strangled him. The protectors had become the executioners. The empire was now a hostage to its own army. And here is the tragedy. While the Ottomans were busy fighting themselves, the rest of the world changed overnight. For centuries, the Ottomans got rich by simply sitting in the middle. If you were in London and you wanted spices from India or silk from China, you had to pay the Ottoman tax. It was the easiest money in history. But then explorers like Vasco da Gama did the impossible. They sailed around Africa. They found a new route to India. Suddenly the trade ships stopped coming to Ottoman ports. The Mediterranean, once the centre of the world, became a quiet lake. The cash flow that funded those massive armies, it dried up. But here is where it gets really frustrating. Rather than tightening their belts, the Ottoman court became addicted to luxury. They were building palaces of gold and crystal, like the Dolmabahce, while their soldiers were marching barefoot. To pay for this champagne lifestyle on a beer budget, they fell into a trap worse than war: debt. And when the Sultan ran out of cash, European bankers were happy to lend it at crippling interest rates. It was like a credit card disaster on a national scale. Soon the Ottoman Empire wasn't fighting wars for land, it was fighting just to pay the interest on its loans. They had sold their economic soul to the very enemies they used to dominate. By the 19th century, the vultures weren't just circling, they were diving. To the north, the Russian bear was hungry and it smelled blood. The Tsar of Russia, Nicholas I, didn't look at the Ottomans with fear anymore. He looked at them with pity and greed. He famously whispered to a diplomat, "We have a sick man on our hands, a man who is terribly sick." It wasn't a diagnosis. It was a death sentence. Russia was obsessed with reaching the warm waters of the Mediterranean, and they treated the Ottoman borders like a punching bag. They hammered them again and again and again. This wasn't just a border dispute anymore. It was a slow-motion execution. The only reason the empire survived this long was because Britain and France were terrified of Russia, so they kept the Ottoman Empire on life support. But the final nail in the coffin wasn't money, and it wasn't Russia. It was a feeling, nationalism. The empire was a puzzle of Greeks, Serbs, Arabs, and Kurds. For centuries they lived together, but as the idea of nation-states spread from Europe, these groups woke up. They didn't want to be subjects of a distant emperor anymore. They wanted their own flags. The map began to tear apart. The empire was bleeding from a dozen different wounds. By 1914, the empire was gasping for air. A group of desperate officers, the Young Turks, seized power. They knew the empire was dying. They needed a miracle. They looked at the map, took a deep breath, and bet everything on Germany. It was a suicide pact. World War I exposed every weakness they had hidden. In the freezing mountains of Russia, tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers didn't even get to fight. They froze to death because they had no winter coats. In the south, the British didn't just attack with guns, they attacked with promises. They sent agents like Lawrence of Arabia to turn the Arab tribes against the Sultan. When the dust settled in 1918, the giant was dead. The winners didn't just want to beat the Ottomans, they wanted to delete them. British and French diplomats sat down with a map and a pair of scissors. They drew straight lines across the Middle East, carving up the carcass of the empire. They ignored the people who lived there, creating the borders that still cause conflicts to this day. The plan was to leave the Turks with almost nothing, a tiny defenseless piece of land in the middle of nowhere. But history had one final crazy plot twist. From the ashes of the dead empire, one man refused to surrender. Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk. He was the only Ottoman general who hadn't been defeated. He looked at the ruins and decided that while the empire was dead, the Turkish nation was going to live. He did the unthinkable. He rallied the exhausted people. He fought off the British, French, Greek, and Italian invaders against all odds. And then he turned his sights on the Ottoman throne itself. He abolished the Sultanate. He sent the last Ottoman ruler into exile. He replaced the old laws with modern ones. He dragged the country kicking and screaming into the modern world. The Ottoman Empire took 600 years to rise and 300 years to die. It is a brutal reminder to every superpower on Earth. Geography is not destiny. You can have the strongest army and the richest history, but if you stop adapting, history will leave you behind.
This is Be Explained. If you want history without myths or noise, subscribe, because the past still shapes the present, and here it is explained.